Okay. Well, we have a really exciting topic today, and I know that for almost all of us, the RFI and submittal review process is one that we're going to all need to go through. And so this is a really timely topic. It's timely at any point in time, and it will really help us to do a better job of working with RFIs. So we're very thankful for our two speakers today. We have Mr. Larry Tabor, a senior structural engineer with Black & Veatch. Larry has 20 years of structural design, inspection, and construction and experience. He's a subject matter expert for concrete construction and construction materials, as well as being a fellow for the American Concrete Institute. And interestingly, now this is an interesting fun fact. Larry has traveled to around 26 countries thus far in his 4+ years of working this project in Poland. I mean, I know a number of us have managed the 26 number, but 26 within 4 years on one project is a substantial number. And then we have Nathan Czuba. And Nathan is with Corps of Engineers Europe District, and he has 8 years of engineering experience working for the Air Force, Michelin, and currently with Corps of Engineers. He's also a civil engineer for the North Carolina Air National Guard. He's supported both programming efforts and managing projects in 7 different countries in Europe, in addition to being licensed in North Carolina. A fun fact from Nathan: snow pellets are called graupel, and although Emma's word doesn't recognize it, it's a word I actually do know. But graupel has been known to fall in northern Poland as late as the end of April, which reminds me of the good old days in Minnesota, which April, May, that would be round about the last. And he's also been downhill skiing in Dubai, which is interesting where you would manage to do that in Dubai that it's cold enough. I do have one short question. Graupel, is that the German word or a Polish word? And do you know the answer to that question?
Yeah, it's actually an English word. It's like little snowballs that fall from the sky, and it's not hail or sleet.
Yeah, it's known here in Germany as well as Graupel. Yeah, so that's and hence the question.
We've seen it as late as May 9th, actually, in 2017. 2017, May 9th. Yes, I've been here that long.
Yeah. So with that introduction, I turn it over to the two of you. Looking forward to it.
Alrighty, I'm going to turn my camera off just because of the bandwidth concerns and stuff. So, see my beautiful mug, or less than beautiful mug, maybe. Okay, I'm going to start the presentation, and then we will flip it over to Nathan here for part of it, and he'll flip it back to me. So the learning objectives are fairly straightforward. It discusses basically RFIs and submittals and what they need to be used for, the different types, who needs to review the roles, things like that. But most importantly, proper language, different styles, powers of front-end documents, some tips that we can give you, something that we've had some hard lessons learned, and we would like to pass them on. As I said, the breakdown's pretty straightforward. We'll start off with talking about definitions, responsibilities, trends, some of the background stuff. Then we'll get into the do's, then we'll do some don'ts, and then we'll get into some tips. Before we get too far, though, I do want to put out the disclaimers that I've been around a while. I've seen a few claims, a few requests for equitable adjustments, and it is not uncommon for a desperate lawyer to throw in and says, well, somebody said something in a presentation once. That's not an official document. It doesn't mean anything with settled construction law. So, what we're going to talk to you today is our opinions, our experiences. Hopefully it's all good stuff, but it doesn't change anything with the relation to the law. All right, so I always start at the very, very basic, assuming that maybe somebody hasn't been involved with this at all. And because of that, I want to make sure that everybody starts at the same level, basically. Submittal. Everybody thinks that probably knows what a submittal is or thinks they know what a submittal is, but this is kind of something that writes it down for you, basically. It's a thing. It's a written or physical information. It's a sample, a shop drawing, a product data, something that basically a contractor who is contractually responsible to submit these things gives it to whoever they have a contract with. Usually in our case, it's the government, government being abbreviated as US government or USG here. In the non-government world, it's sometimes known as an owner or a client. And then that generally flows into the design team. That would be the architect, the engineer, perhaps a subcontractor that's also the engineer architect, depending upon the construction and the contractual relationships. But basically, it's a thing that's given that we review. UFGS, the Unified Facilities Guide Specification, 013300 actually is for the government world is the main document that you'd want to look to for that. It actually goes and defines several different types of submittals, and we'll get into one specific type here on the next slide. But before we do that, I want to talk about RFIs. RFIs, if you get outside the government world, sometimes they're known as contractor information request. More times than not, though, it's an RFI, which is a request for information. It's basically a very formalized procedure to track and monitor and being able to search later on and all that business a particular question. It's supposed to be a question. I'll get into why I say it's supposed to be here in a bit, because sometimes we don't use it the way it's maybe supposed to be used. But it's basically if the contractor has a question or needs some interpretation or an intent or is having trouble finding something on a drawing or something like that. The key thing here, though, is that third bullet. It is not an authority for the contractor to proceed with a change condition. So if me as an engineer comes back and says, yep, Mr. Contractor, we missed this, well, it really should be this, this, or this. So instead of 2 light bulbs, yeah, you got to put in 4. Okay, that is a change condition. And therefore, we should issue a contract modification, and not necessarily to say, okay, go ahead and proceed based upon the RFI response. That's not contractually correct because an RFI does not modify the contract. Okay. So shop drawing. Earlier I mentioned different types of submittals. The shop drawing is probably the most common one. It's a very, very common anyways. And the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is known as the FAR, actually goes far enough to define this in a couple different spots, but this is probably the simplest definition. And the reason why I like to point this one out is because I have, believe it or not, had many different conversations, discussions, arguments, you might want to call them, about what a shop drawing is and what constitutes a shop drawing. Taking a contractor taking the original bid document and submitting it back to them or to the owner is not a shop drawing. It's not specifically adding the information that is needed to be added for conveying the information. Okay, so proposed fabrication, that kind of stuff, installation, how they're going to do that stuff, typically that is not on a contract document. The idea is you want to take the contract document and expand upon it, add your means and methods, add your as they say, form, fit, and function, attachment details, things like that. That is to convey the information to show that you understand what you're doing. That's the contractor showing what they need to do. So understand that this is your opportunity to have that conversation with the owner that says, yeah, we truly do understand what you're trying to tell us. Because if for some reason there's a disconnect there, that's the time to spot it. It's not the time to spot it in the field. That's a bad time to spot it. Okay. All right, so the government, the US government, we have our own ways of doing things that you don't see in the private world. I worked in the non-government field for 12 or 13 years or so, and it's a completely different world on that. USACE has an excellent document, actually, 415.110, which gives you procedures on submittals. It's actually, I believe it's 2012, so it's getting a bit crusty in age, but it's still a pretty good document. The other thing to look at is the classic Form 4025. A 4025 is the cover sheet for a government submittal. It has a lot of information on it, everything from the submittal numbers, obviously, to the type of submittal it is, to the, who's the contractor, and even such important but yet mundane things as the QC manager signing it, saying, yes, I take responsibility for everything that's in the submittal. That's something to always look at. It's lots of information on this stuff. There's 2 main categories of submittals within the government world. One is called government approved, also known as GA, and then the other one was FIO, or for information only. Basically, the GA submittals tend to be the more critical ones, and that's the ones where the government wants to be involved. Whereas the FIO ones, depending upon the project, government is not involved. That is the quality control and the quality control manager. That's their show. And at that point, the government comes in with QA, quality assurance, and checks to make sure they're doing their job, but it's more of a spot check. This tends to be the less critical items. So the GA is all the critical stuff. The FIO is the less critical stuff, simple items, basically. Now, understand that the GA, because it's typically more critical, more detailed, more extensive, you have a longer review period. A typical day, and this can vary by contract, but a typical day of time is 30 days. If it's a variation, that usually adds 2 weeks. So you get a 44-day review time if it's considered a variation. So if a contractor's saying, well, instead of product X that you guys require, we don't want to use that. We want to use product Y, which doesn't have this, this, and this, and this is why it's beneficial to the government, and this is why we want to do it. But because of the different additional research required, it takes more time. So we have 14 days. Okay. The review codes there, and we'll get to on the next slide what these review codes mean. But basically, you got A, B, C, or E is a typical ones. I have been on some projects where, I don't want to say the edict, but pretty much the direction that came down was only A's and E's, guys, only A's and E's. A being acceptable, E being try again. FIOs tend to have a shorter review time, so 14 days is fairly typical. And their review codes are F or X, meaning good or bad. It's an up or down. Okay. I do point this out here, and I'll point it out later, but variations and substitutions are submittals. They're not RFIs, they're only submittals. And then I will do a shout out to if you design build work or some other types of projects, you do sometimes see a DA, which is designer of record approved. It's not as common, and sometimes it's not used necessarily in that manner, but just be aware that it does exist. Okay, alphabet reviews, the alphabet code, the alphabet soup, as you call it, A through G plus X. That is the type of what we call as action codes. They're sometimes known as review codes. Basically, they mean different things, and each one does have a purpose. There's a very good reason why we have all different codes. So to try to limit it to just A or E, for example, can be problematic. I will tell you that in my world, I tend to give more B's and C's, sometimes E's. And my personal difference between a C and an E is it fixable? Is the issue that they're finding or someone's finding fixable? If so, for example, if somebody is submitting something and saying, we want to use a box that's 12 by 12, and yet the hole is only 6 by 6, whatever metric units you want to follow in that, that's not fixable. It just won't fit. Whereas if somebody says, we want to use a brown box, and the contract calls for a blue box, that may be fixable because you may just say, hey, instead of buying the brown box, go buy the blue box. Okay, that's fixable. A codes, codes A and B represent the GA submittals. I want to represent that. It's not that you wouldn't give an A or B code to an FIO submittal. It just doesn't make sense, basically. An F code is a completed FIO submittal. I do want to give a shout out to the rarely used but very beneficial D and G codes. A D code is useful, for example, if you have something that's kind of been overcome by events on site. So concrete finishing is one that I might give an example for. So let's say the contractor was supposed to provide you a sample of their finishing technique, and they didn't. And then all of a sudden we placed all the concrete we're going to place, and then later on they submit a picture of that finish that they already placed. Well, the government may not want to be on the record as actually approving that particular finish for whatever reason. So instead, they can return it by a correspondence, which note it does not say approved, but yet it's completed. It moves past the issue. It's a way to get past an issue that the government may not want to be actually on the record and saying we accept because the process wasn't followed. So they do have applications. All right, roles and responsibilities. This is one of those that varies widely on the projects. And so I will talk about what's common or what's typical that I've seen, but understand it does vary. The first and foremost thing is everybody on a project, there's a reason why they're there. They have a role, they have a part to play. Understand that. Some people want to discount certain people's roles, or they don't want to talk to somebody for various reasons. That doesn't help, okay? It's a teamwork. It truly is a team. The common phrase, one team, one fight. If you start with that attitude, it'll go a long ways. I understand projects sometimes deteriorate and bad things happen and all that business, but at a personal level, try to keep it nice. Be professional. Okay, so design build. Design build projects are a different animal than design bid build. That's the two different main types of contractual processes, if you will. Within the design build world, you can have RFIs and submittals between the engineer and a contractor without the government ever being involved or even knowing about it, really, because it's within the same contract, because there's one person, or I'm sorry, one entity that has the contract with the government. So the other thing with that is there's something called extensions of design. So formwork design, stairs design, steel stairs design, detailing of connections for steel pieces, a lot of stuff like that. Those are called extensions of the design, contractually anyways. And the DOR, because the DOR now works within, is in bed with the contractor, the DOR's involvement on those extensions of design will increase. So something to understand. Now, when you get to design bid build, then generally you can have multiple layers of subs, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I've been on a project where I had down about tier 6. It gets extremely confusing, but understand that a sub, if they've got a question, they cannot ask the government. So the sub can't say, hey, Mr. Government, I have a question. They have to instead ask the prime, who then asks the government. So there's a back and forth there and all that within the RFIs. And this guidance, it's equally justified between both the prime to sub as well as the prime to government. So it's applicable. All right, contractor quality control. The big thing here, they're in charge. Both the contract, the FAR, everything will tell you that with government projects, understand private world separate, but with government projects, the contractor quality control will lead the submittal process, and ultimately they are responsible. That's a very clear statement. Okay. The government's role is not to ensure the correctness. Often there's times where there's a desire for the government to take over and do a lot of that stuff. And it should always remain with the quality control group. Okay. Government provides QA, basically, quality assurance. And by the way, on all this here, I do want to give a shout out to the USACE NAVFAC CQMC training, the Contractor Quality Management Program. It's an excellent course. Takes several days. They've actually, we're doing some here virtually out of the CNOW, out of USACE Europe District. So it's a great course and something you probably ought to take if you're involved in this world. All right, this is my other item. Starts as trends or background, if you will. It's not so much definitions and everything. The use of submittals, what I have found just working in various spots, especially in Europe, is they're not as common in Europe, especially Central and Eastern Europe. Things that you expect in coming out of the CONUS world, out of the United States, you don't find here. Okay, so it's something to have an awareness of because it could affect your bids. It could create contention or problems within the job site. And you're just not even aware of it until all of a sudden it happens, and then you're behind the power curve, and now you got a problem that you're trying to fix while you're in the field, and that's never a good time to fix it. So one example, and just me being a structural engineer, I'm fairly familiar with this one, is that I have a subcontractor that is designing a ductwork, let's say, and we expect, as an engineer in America, when it's an extension design and they make a submittal on the ductwork, we expect fairly detailed shop drawings, and we expect detailed structural calculations that includes, models, files, and output and input and all this other stuff, connection checks. And the first couple times that I got stuff back from a subcontractor, we weren't getting that. And so naturally that was an E-code. No, you need to go fix this. And ultimately, one of my tips later on is to hold a meeting with the contractor, and ultimately we did, and it became very clear that that was just not something they were used to doing. And they were like, "Well, it's going to be hundreds of pages," and I'm like, "Yes, yeah, it will be. Please give me that. That's what I want." So it just was a misunderstanding, if you will. They just weren't aware of it. So something to have a good communication on early. I would say set your expectations pre-bid. In your pre-bid meetings, set out your expectations. We didn't just make this stuff up in the contract. We will expect this kind of statements. Okay, you want that, because if you get away from the submittals and stuff, you tend to get more of the field modifications, we're going to figure it out in the field. We'll just deal with it in the field. And then I don't want to say you lose control, but you just don't know what's going on. And so the problem is eventually somebody's going to ask for as-builts because the end user needs the as-builts to maintain their facility. And if you don't have them, you got a problem. Okay. So that then becomes a really big pain on the back end of a project when it's much more difficult to fix it. So it's much better to fix it in the front end. So think about that. All right, this has been a fairly big trend. First of all, the cost of RFIs, it's about $125 an hour, give or take. You figure each RFI, there's a Navigant study that they did. And this wasn't so much government versus commercial or anything. This was just overall RFI studies. And each one of them takes about $1,000. I would say that on some projects, that number is awfully low. Some numbers it may be high. On smaller projects, that may be high. But on average, it's about $1,000. And you can have some projects where you may only have 20 RFIs, or you can have 2,000 RFIs. You know, when you have 2,000 RFIs, that's a substantial chunk of change to be spending, especially if they're not needed. And this is the trend that we're starting to see. And I say starting to see, we've actually been seeing it for many years now. But basically, RFIs are being used to do things like document agreements. Okay, we had a discussion in the field, and this is what we all said was going to work. You know, and then they'll throw a kind of a fake question in there of government, do you agree? And it's a way to document agreements. In that case, that's not really how an RFI should be used. That's more of a serial letter. A serial letter is a formal communication tool. A lot of people are afraid of the word serial letter, sends dread down people's spines. But a serial letter is really just a letter that has a number attached to it. Okay, it's a formal communication tool. It's a way to track things, and that would probably be better than with the serial letter. The other thing we're seeing is pre-litigation. So instead of filing a claim, a request for equitable adjustment in the government world, they would sit there and give you an RFI of all the reasons why basically they were wronged. And then they'll use that to seek the change order. It's not really the right approach for an RFI. And then the other thing, and I mentioned this earlier, is working off the RFI response and then saying, well, see, you told us in the RFI response to go do this. So we went and did it. So now we want paid for it. Whereas the real proper way to do that is when you're done with the RFI, if there is a change and you see it, you on the government side see it or the designer side, you say, yes, this is a change, modification's coming. Do not do this work until you get the modification. And then the other thing is they want to substitute products and things like that, where that is actually should be a submittal. So the other trend we're starting to see is a large number of RFIs being dumped on the designer of record and the government, simply because they're either A, trying to bump the number of RFIs up, so later on in court, the contractor can go, well, Mr. Judge, sir, or ma'am, we've had 2,000 RFIs on this job, Well, but when you look at those 2,000 RFIs, 1,500 of them are easily like, well, we can't find this, and the answer is go look here. It's no problems. It's just they didn't spend time to look on the drawings. The other reason is they try to slow review times down sometimes. So if you get 15 in a day kind of thing, and 10 of them are easy or 12 of them are easy, so that has happened. Just be aware of it. It's something you should address. Simple conversation sometimes can help that. All right, with that, I am going to see if I can magically hand over control. Nathan, you want to request control maybe?
Yeah, I just sent it.
Oh, there it is. Okay, you should have it, Mr. Nathan. So we're going to switch over to Nathan.
Okay, thanks, Larry. As mentioned, Nathan Czuba from the Corps of Engineers. I may start using you and I or we, and just to clarify, if I say we, I'm referring to the government because I am in a government position. So first off, there's actually a little bit of lag, so we'll see if the slide changes. And I'm not seeing it change. There it goes. All right. First thing, when you get RFIs or submittals, the most important thing is to use clear and concise language. ultimately you're creating a legal document, and things like please and should have no place in there. There's times you use please and there's times you use should. Please is when you're talking to the person one-on-one. You should always be cordial and be friendly and work with them. But in a contract, the word please gives the impression that it's just a request, not a requirement that should be done. If you take a look at your apartment contract, there's never a time that says please don't have pets in the apartment. It says don't have pets in the apartment, and everyone understands that it's not someone being mean. That's just a fact. And the same goes with should. It's a recommendation only and doesn't provide any weight. Now, if you truly want to provide a recommendation, by all means you should. And so keep that in mind when you're completing these responses. And also keep in mind that you should be quoting scripture and verse, specifically the specification or the drawing where you're grabbing that requirement from. And if it's not in the specification or the drawing, then you can drop back one level to the codes or the industry best practices. But remember that if you go too many layers away from the specifications and the contract drawings, it will be harder to make a solid case for that requirement being mandated on your project. And I can't overstress that enough. Always cite your specification or your drawing in your RFI or submittal response. It makes it easier for everyone. It makes sure everyone's on the same page and you go forward at the same time. And to that note, your experience, as you can see from my limited career experience, I have limited experience, but I know the people around me have tons of experience, and I will ask them to draw upon their wealth of knowledge from their experience. But at the end of the day, they need to tie that experience into contract requirements. The experience will lead you in the direction that you want to make your comment, but it has to be with contract requirement specifications in there. And ideally, your response will tie to a resolution. It doesn't have to say this is how it's resolved. If you tie it to the contract, that's where the information is. That's where they can get their solution. But your answers should try to eliminate further questions. Because if you make more questions, then there'll just be a longer back and forth period and it delays the project. No one wants that. It's important to be, like I said, clear and concise. As far as some of the contractual dues, we've all worked on projects where there's a differing condition, whether it's a differing site condition or a different expectation for what the project is. And those, especially in those scenarios, I encourage you to get with your contracting officer or your administrative contracting officer, your ACO, and to discuss those concerns. Some of the minor stuff where there's no anticipated modification to the contract, no funding issue concerns, can be handled by the contracting officer representative. But anytime there's any thought that there could be implications of changing the contract, you want to make sure the KO or the ACO is brought up to speed as quickly as possible. And on that note, everyone knows that none of us are perfect, and that includes designs, that includes how something is constructed, and it's not expected to be perfect. But what is expected of everyone is to be honest. When we're honest, it makes it much easier for the whole team. As Larry said, one team, one fight. It makes it easier for the team to understand that we are working together to get the right solution. And the solution is by contract. And if there needs to be a modification, there needs to be a modification, and we'll work it out that way. But no design is perfect. And when you have these sit-down meetings, whether with the contractor or with other government members, take meeting minutes, take notes, keep track of your important emails, because you'll be gone sometime. For example, I've been on this project for a few months now, but the project's been going on for a little while, and so there's back history that I wasn't here for. But because there's been good documentation by the members here in the government, I can go back and see what's going on with the project. And I can't stress that enough, because people do move around a lot, and it's important to keep that documentation. As for the best practices, we want to, as a government, we want to avoid leading the contractor to a specific solution. As Larry mentioned, the contract is there. It's got the idea of what the government wants, but it doesn't necessarily dictate means and methods. And it's not it's not the government's place to dictate those means and methods. So answer the questions, respond to the submittals, respond to the RFIs, but don't necessarily dictate a means and method to get to that solution. The government, any ACO will tell you I'm sure the government only wants what is in the contract, nothing more, nothing less, just what is in the contract, and that's what we're trying to get everyone on the same page for. Um, when you receive an RFI and you're answering it, those answers can tend to be lengthy because there's a lot of points you want to cover and a lot of issues you want to cover. But the important part is after you've developed your one-page response, if it's that lengthy, to make sure you've included the answer to the question. Sometimes it helps to step away for 10, 15 minutes and come back and say, all right, did I answer the question to the RFI, and specifically put that ideally at the beginning and at the end of the RFI. That way there's no confusion and everyone understands what the government's position and then what their answer to that RFI is. Again, document everything, emails, meeting minutes. And if you're referencing something like that in an RFI or a submittal response, go ahead and include the email or the meeting minutes if they're not easily accessible to other people. Ideally, reference previous submittals or RFIs. Those are also easy to find for other people. It'll give the good breadcrumb for whoever follows after you to understand what's going on. And lastly, on this slide, I just want to say, assume positive intent. Everyone is trying to do the best that they can. We understand that we might have slightly different goals. The contractor might be looking more for a profit, and the government wants to get the best facility that they can out of the words that are on the document. But I guarantee everyone is trying to do their job to the best of their ability. We're not trying to maliciously harm one another. And so if there's I will always tell you to assume there was an accident, even if there seems there's project history that says one way or the other. Just assume they missed something and assume the best of the person, because chances are they are trying to do their best and trying to make the project succeed. Sorry about that. So time keeps ticking on and into the future. That's a quote that Larry put in there from a song. Admittedly, I don't get the reference, but it is a song, I've been told. So I hope you enjoy that reference. When RFIs and submittals come in, make sure you do that first administrative check. There could be a lot of simple things that are missing. We're all human. We all make mistakes. And so if you do that administrative check right off, you can catch whether there's a corrupt PDF file or there's an incomplete cover or missing signatures. And if you catch those, you can send them right back and get those updated quickly. That way you're not adding a week or two to the review time to catch some of those obvious mistakes that are there. And after you've caught those mistakes and you've done that, distribute accordingly to the right subject matter experts so that they can provide the input that they need. And keep in mind, subject matter experts are busy. They're not only working on your project. Unfortunately, it'd be great if we all had just one project that we were all focused on, but we understand that everyone's working on different things. And so because of that, they've got an inbox full of, the SMEs have inboxes full of requests. If something is truly a priority, it's incumbent upon the government assigner and the construction contractor to identify which submittals are priorities so that you can focus on them and help lift the team to succeed as quickly as possible. And then finally, this is the last slide I've got. We talked about it a little bit already, but RFI responses, put that bottom line up front. Like I said, you'll have a whole full body of explanation of what's going on in your RFI, and it makes it so much easier if you understand before you start reading through all the body of the information. This is what the concern of the government is. So put that up front and be clear, be logical in the way you put that. Sometimes RFIs lead to more questions and if that's the case, maybe the proper forum is to call a meeting together and discuss the RFI and the response that the government is about to provide. Just on RFIs alone, sometimes we'll get one, we'll answer it, and we'll see it 2 or 3 times because we think we answer it in thorough review. But and to Larry's point, we're different worlds, America versus Europe, and you just sometimes miss. And if you call and you have that meeting, keep track of your minutes and discuss it, it can really resolve issues a lot quicker than sometimes that back and forth. And on the RFI, I do want to say, you want to answer the question, but then you want to answer the next two questions that come from your answer of the question. And so put yourself in the contractor's shoes when you make that answer to the RFI or the submittal. Put yourself in their shoes and then see if you're providing enough information that they can proceed with the construction. And lastly, before I finish up, I do want to state again, we are one team, truly are, and we are all doing our best. Especially in this overseas environment, there is a language and there is a cultural barrier at times. For example, I remember seeing it on a commercial at one point, but grammar, it can be difficult to translate if you're from a foreign language into English. For example, the phrase "let's eat grandma" could turn into something very bad if it was "let's eat grandma." So keep in mind that there could be differences in languages and differences in cultural expectations, and so as always, assume the best of the other person and assume they're not attacking you personally, but they're trying to find the best resolution for the team. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Larry.
All right. Let's see here. You gotta cancel control, I think. There we go. Okay, I think I got it back. Next slide. So what you should avoid or the don'ts. And notice that I try not to put too much negative connotation on it. The don'ts has a little bit more negative connotation than what you should avoid. And I say that because these aren't, this isn't negative. We're not trying to be negative. This is just ways to break up the presentation, honestly. But we're honestly trying to provide the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how best to do this. As we've said many times, assume positive intent. And I say that in this slide here, if I had to pick the top 3 slides, this is one of the top 3. Emotions run high. I have personally been in knockdown, drag out arguments, and nothing usually good comes out of those arguments. Okay, so when you're not face to face with the contractor, such as when you're doing an RFI or a submittal review, don't get emotional, don't get sarcastic, defamatory, dramatic, and I will even add on to this punitive. It doesn't help. It doesn't look good in the future. It doesn't age well. Okay, if you need to, yell at your computer, yell at a colleague, go gripe, whine, complain, go outside, throw a football or a soccer ball, or the same thing depending upon where you're at in the world. Just do what you need to do. As Colin Powell years ago has said, is get mad, then get over it. Okay. The one piece of advice I'll give you on that one is don't write it down. And the reason why is I've seen too many emails accidentally get sent. Somebody writes a facetious response and forgets to delete it, something like that. I get it. Some people's cathartic is writing, but don't write it down. That's my recommendation. Yell, whatever, use words, but don't write it down. Okay. As I was saying, and as Nathan discussed, some language doesn't translate well, particularly if you write it down, especially American sarcasm. I will tell you, American sarcasm is its own unique breed, and many cultures do not get it or understand it. So if somebody writes something sarcastic on a document, they probably will not read correctly. Okay, so just don't do it. At the same time, I've told you guys this number, don't do that. Okay, it's better instead, and it happens, by the way. It happens where, you know what, I answered this thing 3 times ago. And sometimes, though, I answered it 2 years ago. Like, I've been on this project for over 4 years. I could be like, well, we talked about this 3 years ago. Why don't you remember? It happens. People rotate off the projects. They just don't understand. It's the better approach is to say, you know what? Here's the answer again. You might reference the prior one just so you leave breadcrumbs and you can have consistent responses and things like that. But just reiterate your comment. Don't get an attitude about it, or pull back the contract requirement and say, hey, it's in the contract right here. Okay. The same time, the other thing that can help diffuse a potentially hostile situation is to not throw out specific names. I understand if Joe Blow did the work, company Acme and Joe Blow, by golly, they are the ones that messing up. Don't use the names. Okay. Instead, say, contractor shall do this. The government reviewed this. It is recommended the engineer, the architect, whomever do this. Or if you need to get more specific, the lighting subcontractor needs to look at this. Rather than saying, company X, you can use their descriptive terms of what they are. Okay. The other thing this does, by the way, is I've been on many projects where the contractor's names change. So they get bought out, they go away, and a new one comes in, whatever. And certainly positions change. The people that are on there change. And if you're somebody, Nathan mentioned he's fairly new on this project, and if he's coming in and all of a sudden he's reading a 4-year-old response to an RFI and it mentions a specific name of a person, call it Joe Blow, he doesn't know who that is, and he doesn't know the significance of that person's name. Whereas if instead it said the quality control manager says this, then he knows exactly what position that is and exactly who it's coming from. So that makes it clear. So, okay, this is one, in the middle of a presentation, I usually like to, if it's in person anyways, do somewhat of an audience participation kind of thing, understanding we got some limitations on that, but we're gonna do the best we can. So, sketches. I personally am not a fan of putting sketches in a review if you can avoid it. It's not always avoidable, sometimes you need them, but if you can say it with words, words are better. And it's just simply because sketches can be interpreted 1,000 different ways sometimes, or worse is such as I have here, if it's missing information or it's not quite right, basically. So understand that your review, whether you like it or not, when you make a review or an RFI response, it is a legal document. If you don't believe me, wait until you're involved in the claims world and litigation world, and you have lawyers. One of the first things they will ask for are the submittals and RFIs, okay? Because that's the legal documents, okay? So on this one here, you got the sketch on the left. The issue is basically you got a couple of pipes. They conflict with the beam, and the contractor says, hey, I can't put the beam up. What do you want me to do? Submits an RFI, does that, right? So the questions that I have, and I can't see the chat, but what I'll do is I'll probably just read through kind of what I see, give you a second to think about it kind of thing. Could this, first of all, could this have been done in words? And I would say, this particular issue and the fix that is being shown here, and by the way, the fix is to take and cut some holes in the beam, and then to do what a structural engineer we call DAP, the end of the beam, DAPP or DAP. Basically, you notch out the end of the beam and you have a shorter piece. And understanding beam and pipe conflicts happen a lot, so this is fairly common. This one here, honestly, is a borderline item. I could describe this in words. I've done it in the past. I would say contractor shall add stiffener of X size located at edge of cut. Cut shall be so inches wide by so inches tall at end of beam. Typical connection shall be replaced with a 1/4 inch fillet weld, top and bottom, and then both sides. Which, by the way, I don't say all around here because then you get into some funny business with the ends. That's why it's not detailed that way. I could do that. This is one case though that, it's borderline. It could be an actual sketch, but if it's a sketch, the next question I'm going to ask is what information is missing and what would be needed for the contractor to safely perform their work. Give me a second to think about that. So again, without, if it was live participation, I'd have you guys shout out answers, but some thhave that I see, and I'm the one that drew this, so I intentionally didn't fill it out intentionally, so I'd have something to talk about for example purposes. But you have pipes, right? What's the diameter of those pipes? How much clearance is needed around those pipes? What does the insulation go through? Does it not? Is it stop there because that affects the size of the hole you need to cut out? Are there minimum dimensions needed between the new hole and the top flange? So I have a hole here. Let's see if I can't use my mouse if you can see it. I have a hole I'm cutting in my beam. Now, as a structural engineer, a hole in a web is not a horrible deal, okay? But you get too close to the top up here, up to the root, right of the web to the flange, and that I become a little bit more worrisome about. Okay, so is there a minimum distance that needs to be put there? What's the maximum dimensions that are allowed to be cut, especially at this dapped end over here? I don't want something that cuts out 2 feet when I only need 6 inches. I want as much left as I can. Okay. What's the minimum amount of the dapped end required for the web length? So again, right here, I have a vertical section of the web. I have some design that I need for a web size. What's the minimum there? Okay. But basically, things like that. Any temporary supports that need to get done. What type of cutting? Do you allow torches? Do you allow only plasma cutters? What do you allow? Okay. Personally, I don't like flame cuts, but plasma might be okay in this situation. And then any overcut allowed, any radiuses needed. So, temporary bracing. Yeah, somebody I see in the chat, somebody put temporary bracing. Absolutely. Any temporary supports put in there. That goes straight to safety. I don't have a connection there. Thing could fall down. Okay, so with all that said, I think it's clear that at some point information is missing. If this were to go forward in an RFI, then it would need some more information. And before I go to the contract implications, I do want to answer. Sharice had a question asking about photos. Photos and drawings are fairly similar, except photos are a much better situation, especially annotated photos. Annotated photos can go a good way to document an issue in RFI, but the same criteria is still applicable with sketches. You need to make sure that they're well documented, that you're not missing obvious information and things like that. Okay, contract implications. First question I'm going to ask, whose responsibility was it to coordinate? If it's the contractor's responsibility, then that means that this is more or less offering a solution for an issue that the designer, the person who ran the structural calculations for that beam, would be okay with. That's not a contract mod at that point. That's a fix, okay? However, if it was the designer's responsibility to coordinate these two things, let's say for some reason the designer showed the exact elevation of that pipe, they showed the exact size of that beam, and they have non-deviation requirements or something like that, then at that point, this becomes a contract modification, okay? So if it is in fact an error, at that point, that could be extra work because there's extra work to cut that beam and to add a stiffener and changing the connection and all that business. It's not their normal practice. So at that point, your response should be, here's the fix, but a contract mod is coming. Please don't perform this work until we're done, until you get the contract mod. And by the way, I use the word please there. You wouldn't actually put the word please as we mentioned before. Okay. All right. So what's some contractual items? First and foremost, if there's a question in your mind of whether or not you are responding back with something that may not be in the contract, or if you need some interpretation, the only two people that can modify that contract are the administrating contracting officer and the contracting officer. That's it. Okay. No one else can modify a contract. So you better ask them about it and see what their decision says. Okay. At the same time, if it will indicate it, as we said before, say, hey, we've got a mod coming, don't start until later, okay? But never intentionally require something that is beyond the contract. That's poor form, okay? Avoid dictating means and methods. I will say there are times where your contract might already get into a means and methods. It may say, like, so for instance, concrete curing, right? Concrete curing, there's wet methods, there's dry methods, there's membrane curing, there's all sorts of other stuff. Certain slabs I may not want cured with a membrane compound. I may want, instead of wet curing, a wet burlap. So I may tell you, hey, for this type of slab here, you shall use a wet curing method. That is dictating means and methods in the contract, and that's perfectly fine because the contractor, when they signed up for the job, they agreed to those set of circumstances. The difference is if for some reason we didn't say that, and then all of a sudden the contractor wants to use membrane curing, which by the way is cheaper to do than wet burlap curing. And if we say, no, we wanted wet burlap curing, okay, that is a change because now I'm requiring a more expensive method than what I required in the contract. So I cannot dictate that means and methods, okay? I can enforce whatever's already in the contract. And then as we said before, RFIs should not be used for variances or products, okay? That's what submittals are for. This is a very common issue, by the way. RFIs don't have the contractual authority to modify a contract, okay? So because they don't have the contractual authority, you need to go to the submittal route, which then has clauses within the submittal specifications, 013300 for the government, and there are procedures that say this is how you do that, and then you can address it that way. There are a lot of requirements and a lot of extra hoops, and people don't necessarily want to jump through those hoops, so sometimes we try to back end it and use the RFIs as the way to do it, and that is not a good way to do it. Okay. So submittal reviews, this is just purely submittals. As I said before, performance-based items You don't want to get into means and methods and into their design. This is something that as an engineer, I struggle with. It's like, man, I got a way I want to do it, But if it's a performance-based item, understand there's more than one way to crack the nut, okay? And as long as the nut gets cracked as a performance-based item, that's all I asked for in the contract. If I say I want you to go build me a box that's 12 inches by 12 inches by 2 feet tall, okay, and you get me a box that way, I can't tell you how to do it. I told you what I want. That's a performance-based design. At the same time, when you're reviewing, one thing you will find quite a bit, especially when you get a lot of layers of subcontractors sometimes make exclusions. And I recently had a project where a steel erection firm excluded welding, okay, which is very common for steel erection. But because they excluded welding and then the prime agreed to that, at that point, understanding me as a reviewer, it's not my problem that they did that, but I have to deal with it when I'm reviewing submittals and they're trying to use a bolted connection instead of a welded connection because I need a welded connection. Okay, that is not a they can change means methods. I ask for a bolted connection for specific reasons. Now, if they want to do a variance and ask and say, hey, can we use a bolted connection instead of a welded connection? And oh, by the way, here's the capacity differences and everything's fine. That's something that I could evaluate and possibly approve. But at the same time, check your exclusions. Check to make sure if it's supposed to be signed and sealed, is it signed and sealed? Okay. Lastly, on this slide, which by the way, slide 25 for anybody that's following along, a C-coded submittal, it gets interesting because some people claim a C-coded submittal is not approved, and that's not true. It is approved. However, the specific issues that were noted are not approved. So basically, the parts that we didn't comment on, they're good. But things that we commented on, you shall correct and then resubmit. That is a contractual requirement. Okay. Because of that, a reviewer typically, and I say typically, should avoid giving a whole new bite at the apple. Okay. You don't re-review the whole thing when you get a resubmittal. Instead, you're supposed to take a look and say, okay, I made X comment, Y comment, and Z comment. They've picked up X and Z, but they missed Y. I got to make another comment on that. Okay. Here's where I say generally or typically. Sometimes the changes the impact of the entire submittal. The whole flavor of it changed. At that point, yeah, you probably got to redo the whole thing. Okay. The other aspect of this is the temptation is huge to go look at a bunch of other stuff, right? And let's say you accidentally, as a reviewer, you say, whoops, I missed commenting on this, and I should have commented on that. Depending upon how bad it is, think twice, okay? I'm not saying ignore it. I'm not saying don't comment on it. I'm saying maybe it's a B code instead of another C code, for instance, because we're trying to get done. We don't want a perpetual review cycle here, okay? And is the comment truly a problem, basically? But deal with it honestly, okay? Don't try to hide it. Don't try to blame it, whatever. Understand that if it's a submittal and the contractor's already working through something else, and then now this is really going to be impactful for them, you may want to have a meeting with the contractor and say, hey, look, I missed this on the first round. The other thing to understand on that, though, is the government review, as I said before, is quality assurance. It's not quality control. I don't want to say your review means nothing, but from a legal world, it is still incumbent upon the contractor to have the correct submittal. So if you do find something later, you can always lean back on that. Just be very understanding about that and the impact to the contractor. At the same time, some other don'ts. If you're done, you're done. Okay. I've seen too many people that either out of spite or some other version, or they want to sit on it for an extra long time. If you're done, send it back. It doesn't help anybody to sit on a submittal or an RFI. As a DOR, I personally am a designer of record. I fully understand that it is my role to make recommendations. I don't make the final decisions. I don't necessarily have my comments go directly to the contractor. My comments go to Nathan, and then Nathan will tweak them, will aggregate them with all the other advice he's getting, and make one common comments. Sometimes there's very good reasons why they will change your comment because they're aware of some additional information, or there's different reasons why. But just be aware. Okay. The last couples, they get into how to process submittals and items, and when you find an item, and sometimes it's a timing problem. So let's say you are reviewing a submittal, right? And you find a problem. Well, if that problem is old, let's just say, I would probably rather see a revised submittal than holding up the current submittal because you have a problem. Okay, so for example, somebody was supposed to have installed drip pans underneath a piece of pipe. Okay, how can I edit that when I'm reviewing the pipe submittal, and yet I didn't comment on it before? Okay, but now I'm reviewing a support submittal or something like that. At some point, you don't want to have a good submittal held hostage because of an old issue. It's better to instead, there's ways to handle that. One, in a USACE or an NAVFAC projects, there's submittal registers. Okay, government projects have submittal registers. You can add a submittal register item, that is the drip pans, for example, in this case. In that situation there, it would be tracked by the submittal register, because at some point at the end of the day, somebody goes through and says, what else is missing? And they'll find that in the submittal register. You can also do deficiency. Hey, they installed this and they didn't follow the contract documents. Okay, but it's been installed. So things to think about on that. All right, some tips. I mentioned my top 3 slides. This is one of my top 3s. Okay, communication. I am a huge fan of communication. It's one of those things that if you have good communication, a lot of other problems can go away. Okay, good, clear, honest communication, assume positive intent and all that, very important. Okay, understanding that goes before, during, and after reviews. I would often say that I shouldn't get an RFI that I'm not already aware of. My hope would be the contractor has already come over to me and said, hey, Larry, I see a problem here. And maybe it's a simple, well, you need to go look at the drawing over here, X, Y, and Z. And then you don't even get an RFI because you've answered the question that was very easy to ask. Or they say, yeah, I see a problem here. And maybe I don't know the answer right away. And they say, okay, yeah, you probably ought to submit an RFI and we'll take a look at it in more detail. Okay. At the same time, after reviews, there is definitely a case to be made for having meetings and things like that as a follow-up. Okay, when I'll talk about that in a minute. If communication collapse, we've literally had collapses because of poor reviews and poor communication, things like that. The Hyatt in Kansas City, classic example back in the 80s. We need to be careful. Safety is paramount, of course, but also quality and cost can suffer. Okay. All right, here's some more tips. This is, I would say, a loose collection of tips. How about that? One thing we have found doing fairly large projects, and it may not make sense for smaller projects, but for large projects, we have found to document standardized processes, databases, file name rules, email headers, because emails can be sorted. And if somebody does it 3 different ways, it's hard to find things. Okay, do that early on a project. It should be able to be audited. You need to understand the limitations between the systems. So for instance, DOR, as a DOR here, I have a CAC, but I use my my government. I don't use a government computer. I use my company's computer. Therefore, I don't have access to RMS. At the same time, ProjNet, there's some file name limitations. There's some file size limitations. So just understand the different limitations and work with people on it. But get those processes started early. One other process, again, for larger projects, it makes really good sense. Smaller projects, maybe not, is to take a project account, a project inbox that is not tied to a specific person and use that as a repository. Okay. That way you can copy the project inbox or copy the project account when you're sending important things. And at that point, it's going to stand out there. It's going to be perpetual and it'll be backed up and documented. And people that come along behind you after you're well gone off the project will be able to find your stuff. Because when you're gone, your stuff goes with you. Okay, your memories go with you, your verbal oral history goes with you, as well as your emails. Yeah, you can back it up. You can put it in a separate folder. You can do all that kind of stuff, but it's harder to find. Okay, so it's recommended to consider putting a separate account that's strictly for one project, that is not tied to a particular person, that somebody monitors and deals with. It's not just a black hole. can sort them and put them in different folders and things like that. But it makes a great way to deal with later on. You can find prior discussion on a particular topic. Okay. Within your next submittal, I recommend numbering comments. The one thing I say is, of course, check to make sure your numbers, you don't have 2 number 5s, for instance, at the end of the day. But numbering comments makes it easier to discuss later. One thing that I've done on a few projects is we have created individual action codes or review codes for each comment. This may sound like extra work, but it's really not. Typically, when you are making a review and you're putting down a comment, in your head, you're already thinking whether or not this is something going to cause a rejection or not. It's just easier if you go ahead and state it. And what that does is that allows a contractor to hone in and focus on those really bad ones first, okay? But things you need to address, because this does happen, is that you could, let's say, have 20 B code comments, for example, and 20 B code comments, sometimes it becomes hard to justify saying, well, that's a C code. You know, do you have enough circumstantial evidence to convict, basically? At some point, you also get the minor comments and then a couple of major ones, and then nobody wants to talk about the minor ones. They only want to talk about the major ones. So you have to deal with that honestly and openly in conversation with the contractor. Say, hey, look, just because I am, not, I don't have any B code individual comments doesn't mean I can't make a C code overall. And for example, if I say this in a comment just because it's a B code, I still really care about this. Okay, please still work with this. The last item on your next submittals is avoid making comments within the body of the submittal if you can. It's not always possible. Sometimes you have to, but the reason why I generally don't like doing that is because, number one, they get out of sync, and number two, they get lost. So some people would want to put the exact same comment in a review form that they put in the body of the comment. Well, let's say I do that, and then I hand it back to Nathan. Well, then Nathan tweaks my comment because of some reason why. Well, now I've got out of sync comments, and that's not good. Okay, so if you're going to do that, make reference within the comment form, but don't repeat the comment. Okay, say see section 4 for additional comments up in your review form, and then in section 4 have the comments individual. All right, I'm a fan of keywords, and that again is because searching, I tend to be on projects that last a while and memories fade. So if you have good keywords or good able to be searchable later on, that tends to work well. The trouble is some words, abbreviations and footing versus foundation versus FD, FNDN versus footer, whatever. They're all different words that mean really kind of the same thing. So have a standardized list. That's the best thing with that one. And then, as Nathan talked about with your review forms or responses or whatever, take a step back, breathe. The obvious spelling, grammar errors, obviously you want to catch those. The biggest thing for me is, has the question been answered? Whatever was asked, did you answer it? Because if you went off on a tangent and totally misinterpreted what the person said, you're going to get another question. Just make sure you answer the question asked. The other thing, and this could have almost been a don't, but I put in some tips, but avoid the slang and contractions. Again, if English isn't the local language, a slang term may not work, basically. At the same time, there's also cultural sensitivity with slang that sometimes doesn't go well. Words that we may think are politically correct in our world are not in other worlds. So adjust your response. Try to be sensitive about that. There's no point putting somebody on the defensive or upsetting somebody over a word. Okay, pick your words better. At the same time, do you have your attachments? Because that's pretty common. And then your file names. Make sure they're correct. Okay. In terms of front-end documents, I mentioned this before, the power of front-end documents. Okay, I obviously talked before about 013300, which is the submittal forms, but there are a lot of really good clauses up in the front-end documents, which are Division 0 and Division 1, that you should be aware of. Okay, because Division 0 and Division 1 documents, if you're searching for something to make your case, if you will, that's maybe where they're going to be at. So what I tend to do, or recommend doing anyways, is to go through them at the beginning of a project. Number one, read them. There's a lot of power there. A lot of times it's the government side that maybe developed them, but then the engineers are the ones that are using them. So read them. But then the other thing is make yourself some tables or notes to some special ones, such as English as the submitted language, for instance, variance requests, quality control, what the order precedence is. That's a very common one. There's a couple of other ones in there that basically literally say if it's manifestly necessary to complete the project, even if I didn't show it, it's still your fault. There's sections like that I'm not going to get into the legalities of it, but it's there and you could follow it as well. Okay. The last set of tips that I've got would be informal reviews. They're common. They happen. Email reviews, bootleg copies. They go by different names. They're great. The only thing is don't be excessive with them. At some point, you got to get down to the brass tacks and you got to get down to the actual submittal, and it's got to go on record, and you got to get everything in writing, and you got to do the work. Okay. If you get more than one or two of these informal reviews, it's probably time to start actually doing an actual review. But because they're outside the official process, you get a little bit more freedom to have some more discussion, some more back and forth between the contractor and the engineer, and even with the government involved, of course. But there is a process, and it is there, and government's been doing this a long time, guys. Okay, there's a reason why it's there. It works. And the last item, as we've mentioned throughout this presentation, meetings, communication. If you get a submittal and all of a sudden you find a problem, it's missing information or whatever, if Nathan calls over the contractor and says, "Hey, Joe, you're missing yada yada," and it's like a 5-second phone call, but it'll fix a huge problem, that's worth it. Okay. At the same time, after you get a review, if I've battered the heck out of this submittal and I've got 30 comments in there and they're all major, we probably ought to have a meeting to discuss that, because at that point they clearly didn't understand, and then, as we said, shop drawings before, to convey their understanding, they didn't understand. So at that point, we need to have a meeting, because saying what you need to say in different words and different everything can mean more things. I mean, basically, if you say it differently, it comes across better. You may retweak something, you may emphasize a different word, and the contractor's light bulb goes off and he says, "Aha, okay, I understand what you're saying now." And then maybe the next resubmittal is going to be a lot better. But as Nathan says, don't forget the meeting notes. Meeting notes on that are very important. All right, so we're wrapping this up, but basically, as I say, communication. I almost just put that solely because that is one of the most important pieces. At the same time, understand the time, understand where you're at in the critical path processes. Just be timely as you can. We get it that, especially if you're in the home office or something and you're working 10 jobs at once, we get it. You may not be able to jump right on something, and you have contractual dates. You may have 2 weeks to review a submittal or something. Just understand, though, if the contractor's really in a bind and you can help them out, this is a team effort. Okay. Front-end documents are pretty powerful. And then everybody wants truly to get a safe construction project that's within budget. Understand that. Okay, submittals and RFIs are extremely critical for that, and hopefully, with these tips and thoughts and stuff, that'll help. Again, we've seen a lot and we do a lot, and hopefully these will help. With that, I do have one last quick thing. So there's a guy named B. Liddell Hart. He's an old guy that has a negotiation creed that I thought was very apt. I'm not going to read it here. You guys are capable of reading, but at the same time, understand that when you're negotiating, it's about respect. It's about helping the other guy and making sure that at some point you can be strong, but understand there's probably an answer in the middle somewhere. It may not be fully on the left side or fully on the right side, it's somewhere in the middle. That's pretty common. With that, opening up to questions, I think I'm supposed to turn my monitor back, or my screen back on, right, Charisse?
Yes, thank you. If you and Nathan would both come back on camera. Welcome your questions. You can pop them in the chat, or you can use the raise your hand feature and we'll call on you. Michael, do you want to moderate the questions?
That's fine. Thank you. All right, so let's take a quick look here. I don't have any messages in the chat at the moment. And if you have any questions, of course, as Cherie said, you can raise your hand, or at this point, since it's relatively quiet, you can jump in and ask as well.
I had one question. You know, you said that you're not a big fan of sketches, but are photos a good way to document an issue in an RFI? Can you put that into the submittal register? You're on mute, Larry.
Thank you, Sharice. I am on mute. Yeah, and this is just my opinion, but typically words are best, photos are next best, sketches are last. Photos are good, but similar caveats though, because you can, if you have a missing information or something that they really needed, you have the same problem as with a sketch. The advantage of a photo is that you're already kind of given the situation, right? Now that means though that necessarily the situation has progressed enough that you have something to take a picture of. So in some cases, like let's say on that example I had where the pipe and the beam conflict, if somebody recognized that before the beam's ever even there, or the pipe's ever even there, you got nothing to take a picture of. So, but yes, as a general statement. Wait a minute, Sharice, who did you say with their challenge was to stump me or something? What'd you say yesterday or a couple days ago?
That was Joe Copeland with USACE, and he had to jump off the call. He had
That's all right.
Had another meeting.
That's right.
But Michael can come up with one.
Yeah. Surely we didn't do that good of a job, guys. Come on. There's, I don't know, 670, give or take people. Somebody's got a question.
We were up to 89 people at one point.
It's all Nathan. So
yeah, I was actually very, very pleased with the whole thing. It covered a lot of things. What I found really helpful is the number of examples of things going well, things going wrong, things that have come up that help in the process. You know, so that was really, really great. And I greatly appreciate that. And actually, I don't have a clever question to go with it this time, so.
No problem. Yeah, and we contemplated putting in actual examples and then having discussion about the examples, but in this format, that just becomes a little bit more tricky. And at the same time, you know, we would have had to cut something else out, so we just beware of that. But yeah, it's generally understanding that the be nice principle, the golden rule kind of thing, as well as be thorough, always scripture and verse. That's a huge thing. You want to document, but you want to be referencing, you know, actual specs and drawings and stuff. I mean, look, I've got a lot of experience. I've got opinions on the matter. I've got desires. Okay. I mean, I want certain things. And if like, dang it, you know, that drawing just didn't cover it, you know, and there's only so much I can do about it. And at some point, that's the contract. And, you know, people that know me will say, I say, call a spade, you know, if it's a spade and the contract didn't cover it. And now, if you really need it, okay, that's a contract mod, you know, just how it is. And some designs are better than others, and some contractors better than others. But generally, everybody's trying to do the right thing. And all projects finish.
Sooner or later.
Yes. Oh wait, here we got one here. RFI is being used justify non-conformance. Okay, so I see the question is I've seen the use of RFIs as a means to deviate from the contract designs or even specs. RFI is being used to justify non-conformance to supply alternative solution, usually more expensive for the contract. How can we handle these? Okay, so that absolutely true. That is one of the trends that we have seen more and more lately. I would say 20 years ago, I didn't really see that. And RFI was truly asking a question. But in today's litigious world, that does happen. Typically, I try to first and foremost, again, bottom line up front on your RFIs, I respond back, say, hey, this is not the right form for this. You need to submit this as a submittal. And XYZ, you know, reference 013300, section 1.8, for instance, for variations. You know how many times that occurs if I have the number memorized. But you want to reference that first and foremost. But there are times where you get a response or them proposing something or whatever that just completely isn't going to work. Okay, so to simply tell them, hey, you need to tell me and ask for it in a response, or I mean in a submittal, knowing that you're probably going to not accept that submittal to begin with, later on when it does come in, that just is a waste of everybody's time. So it usually helps to follow up after you start off and say, wrong format. It usually helps then to come back and say, however, this proposal is not going to be acceptable because of XYZ or something like that. Or if it is acceptable, maybe mention that, but to say, hey, this does not change the contract. You need to submit something so we can change the contract. So, not only address the contractual and the procedural aspects, but also address the technical aspects.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and in that vein, I mean, I think that's one that I've used in the past where the regulation is not clearly defined, especially when you're talking
yes.
about a conflict between the US regulation and the host nation regulation, and the RFI would then present this is how we view things, this is how we see it working out for the benefit of the government, and then you get your fake question, do you find this acceptable?
Right. Now, in that case there, I would actually argue that that's, and that's an excellent example, Michael. I would actually argue that that is a perfect use of an RFI, because there you're looking more for interpretation. You're saying, hey, I see this this way. Or an example, fire protection engineers. I was off the top of my head here. Fire protection engineers, what I have seen on European projects versus CONUS projects is the interpretation of what is an FPE and what the equivalent of the FPE is widely different. Some people argue there is no equivalent to an FPE from America, therefore we need the FPE from America. So trying to hash some of that out in an RFI, that is what an RFI is for. Yeah, if ultimately you find that it's not just an interpretation and it's an actual modification, then that's where the submittal and the other stuff gets into. Whereas if it's interpretation and people see contracts differently, we always say the minimum is a contract, the maximum is a contract, and that's true. But contracts are open to interpretation sometimes, and there's a little bit of gray area. But that's where the ACO or the KO need to be involved.
Good.
Okay, well, we are straight up on 1300, so I will send it back around the room for one more go for anyone who has a last minute comeback question. Going once, going twice. All right.
I'll let you say that in German.
Okay.
This was a lot of content in here. We really appreciate Nathan and Larry for doing this. This was excellent. A lot of detail. I bet we get a lot of downloads on this one.
Yeah. And the intent was to get it all kind of written down. As a normal presentation goes, I shouldn't have that many words in the slideshow, but I'll break that rule if it helps somebody later.
Yeah, quite so. Okay, well, Charisse, that was a good close for us. I really appreciate the two of you. It was a very, very informative presentation, and I think helpful in many aspects for clearing up some things that, some questions that we often have with RFIs. So we thank you once again, and for those of you who are interested in SEMI, who are from the outside the organization, please look towards joining, and in particular, if you'd like to serve in some capacity as an officer within SEMI, we do have a lot of openings in Kaiserslautern this year due to PCSs and other things. So I'd really encourage you to serve in the SEMI organization. It's good for the military. It's good for business. It really is a good thing for all of us. So we'd really invite you to join if you have not joined already. And you could talk to either myself or Charisse if you have any questions about that.
The networking is great.
Yeah. And Charisse, unless you have any follow-up close your remarks, then let's close today's presentation. Thank you very much. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Aries.
Thank you and have a nice day.